Peter was born and raised in Brooklyn. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh. And these two East Coast kids kind of wandered into Eugene, Oregon for our first faculty positions.
During that 70s era, Eugene, Oregon looked really good.
So we were on the faculty at the University of Oregon for over 30 years.
Wow.
And then we said to each other, it's great to be teaching college students and MBAs. What we really want to do more of now is move on to real people in the real world, doing the real work. And that's what we do now.
And we've been researching for so long. We had this huge body of research, and we realized they really condensed into three main bodies of work. One body had to do with conflict resolution, another to teamwork and team development, and then the third had to do with persuasive presentations. And so we took that body and we carried it out to the rest of the world. And that's what we've been doing for the last bunch of years.
This is what I find so fascinating about your story, because many people talk about an experience in academia, many people talk about their real world experience, but here you are having significant experience in both. How is that transition?
Going into the real world of work really convinced us that it's not easy for people to do conflict. I mean, that's one of the centerpieces of our research. Trying to figure out what stops people, why do people avoid conflict, and how can we make a real life difference in everyday lives of people doing their real life work.
Because what we discovered was the most common problem we have seen across organizations, public and private, across countries around the world, is this whole notion of avoidance. I have a difficult issue to raise with someone. Rather than talking to that person, I'll talk to someone I'm more comfortable with. I'll bond with that other person. We'll bond over why we can't talk to this other party.
And the toxicity of silence cannot be overstated.
Yeah, it's the worst, actually. Because when we've had a bad moment and then we go silent with one another, each party fills that void with negative assumption. We start thinking the worst about one another.
Can you unpack that a little more? Because I think that's a really prevalent topic for a lot of entrepreneurs and people in any role, right?
Absolutely. So when my choice is to stop talking to you, bad stuff happens.
Sure.
And we really deeply believe that when people don't have conflict working for them, it is because they're unconscious in that. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So someone says something or does something. It rattles me, it disturbs me. I have a reaction. It's an autopilot reaction, and that's how most people interact with conflict. I should be able to get from every conflict scenario, an important problem is solved, a key relationship is strengthened, and trust is deepened.
I'm interested in your experience speaking to leaders around the world and their awareness of their conflict avoidance, and whether they have it, whether they know that they avoid conflict, or whether they're sort of blind to it.
Question number one, how many of you in the last 3 or 4 months had someone at work or at home say something or do something that disturbed you enough that you were even thinking about it in the night, and when you woke up it was still on your mind? Virtually everyone raises their hand. Then the next question, how many of you, when you woke up the next day and it was still on your mind, went to the person and talked to them about it?
Usually it's a handful, sometimes it's none.
And then the question, if you had said something or done something that was that disturbing to another person, how many of you would want them to talk to you about it? Every hand goes up. So,
and then the question becomes, how could that be?
Right.
I mean, how can we have a room full of people where everybody values the importance of bringing up these difficult issues, but when push comes to shove, virtually no one in this room did it?
People have all kinds of reasons for not raising issues.
So more specifically, an entrepreneur might say to us, I've got this person who's been a great performer and they're one of my key people, but suddenly there's been a change and they're just not stepping up anymore. And I'll say, well, so what did you say? Well, I haven't said anything yet because I'm afraid they'll leave and they'll be really hard to replace. So people have all kinds of reasons for not getting into the fray. And I think some of them are aware of it, and I think some of them are completely blinded to it.
It's been our experience that unresolved conflict is the key to so much, not just organizational discord, but it has everything to do with organizational performance. I would encourage any business leader to look at the pain points that they're currently facing. The majority of them have communication at their core. It's about not being able to talk about how to fix that, how to change that, how to move on to that. We have had a number of conversations with Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great. And Jim has seen the interface of his work and our work as this. No organization can ever get from good to great if people aren't talking about what's not great yet.
So where do you start? I mean, I'm a big fan of models and frameworks, and I feel especially excited about talking to you guys because you've had decades to really build and prove out yours. And I feel like many entrepreneurs and leaders have high emotional intelligence, but still really struggle with conflict avoidance.
Exactly.
And certainly in how to resolve and deal with conflict. I'm even thinking to my personal examples. I've had moments where I just haven't known what to do. So what do we do?
Well, we start, when we're speaking about conflict, we start in why doesn't it go well? And we talk about concepts like intent and impact. And in conflict, intent rarely matches impact. Even a simple question like, is the report ready yet? My intent is to get the part of the report that you're working on, but the impact is probably something along the lines of, so where is it? Let's get the lead out. What is taking you so long? So often our intent gets held hostage. So for example, one of the keys when raising a delicate issue is to talk about your part in the issue that you're raising. And I'll tell you, before we put this in here, we looked at thousands of problems, and invariably, both people own a piece of the action. But the act of saying to you, hey, listen, I'm not putting this one all on you. I own part of this problem too. It's so releasing. It kind of pulls the bottom out of the resistance and allows us to move through the rest of the model. One person said recently, doesn't it take two to tango? And our response was, yeah, but it only takes one person to change the dance.
So you obviously do this globally. How does culture play a role in the way that we resolve conflict? Because this audience will no doubt be global.
Globally, we've discovered that the pattern is similar, but the avoidance gets more extreme in certain cultures.
Tell me about the symptoms that people see in their businesses, in their families, in their, charitable organizations across the board, because it sounds to me like it's prevalent throughout it all. If people either know they have a conflict issue or don't know, what are some of the symptoms we can look out for?
Say a little more about what you mean by symptoms.
So things we can see in our businesses that point to the conclusion that there is some conflict and some team dynamic and some communication issues that need resolving.
When people think about conflict, what is conflict? They think about people yelling and shouting at each other. Well, of course, that's conflict. But we see a much deeper view of it. So what we're talking about are not just people who are out of control and anybody would look at them and say, oh, they're in deep conflict. We're talking about all of those times when you really want someone to do something different than they're doing. You want them to do something better. You want them to do something more often. You want them to stop doing something. Those are the kinds of conversations that people avoid.
And sometimes, I mean, another one of the subtle symptoms is information isn't being passed on easily. Some people hold on, you've heard the notion information is power, and some people really play that out. And in subtle ways, I just don't tell you all you need to know to be successful, because in some weird sense, I feel like I've got this bailiwick, this area of my knowledge, and I need to hold on to it. Because if I hold on to it, I'll be more valuable to the company. It's kind of my insurance that I'll be wanted and needed here. And so there isn't this easy flow of communication, and so sales drop, balls in various areas don't get completed, and it's hard to see.
I mean, imagine how different it would be if, when we had these sorts of issues, just like the one I mentioned, we just talked to each other, we worked it out, we created a solution, we each took our own accountability for our part of the problem. We listened deeply and powerfully to when people were saying things that were different from our experience. And we could solve these issues and nobody even else has to know about them. This can happen when this becomes deeply embedded in an organization's culture. It looks different, it feels different.
Can we kind of shift to the family? Because I know entrepreneurs care deeply and passionately about their families as much as their business.
Absolutely.
In many cases. How do we foster a great culture in our families?
I would say number one would be...
Before you give your good answer,
Yes?
I want to be very honest here. When our daughter was 13 years old, I used to start our programs in conflict resolution by saying the things we teach work for everyone except adolescent teenage daughters, because I felt like a fraud, because ours was out of control. And it seemed like, whatever we said, she said the opposite, and we were battling all the time. Although I must say, as we look back on it, we realize we weren't using what we knew so well, because we were getting hooked so quickly. So I did want to start there, because it's easy to sit here and look like
here's what you need to do to have the perfect family and relationship.
Like we have. I mean,
Yes.
no, we
Right.
struggled too.
No, cut that one, right, exactly. So I think, though, even in the worst of times, for better or for worse, we never did use silence as a weapon. And that would be, to me, a real go-to commitment. Because when couples use silence as a weapon, their children learn that as a habit. And because in the end, we learn our conflict resolution skills from the people we see do it most, which is our parents, right? So anything we do as spouses, as life partners, our kids see and they do too. So when silence is used as a way to control, it is a spiral down that is never ending in its negative consequences.
And so when we're working with a family, the real key and the fallback strategy invariably is great listening. Sometimes the best you can do, and the few breakthroughs we had during that adolescent teenage years of our daughter, is when I can keep my big mouth shut and just sit there and really listen and really. I remember one time that I had just had a hernia operation and it was really hurting, and so I was sitting on the floor in the kitchen, and my daughter walked in. My 13-year-old daughter walked in, saw me on the floor, and sat down and started talking to me, and I just paraphrased what she was saying. I asked her questions. I just was a great listener to her. And then she got up and she said to me, "Dad, this has been a really good conversation." I didn't put one word of my own thinking into it. And I mentioned that to her recently. She remembered that moment. I mean, she's almost 40 years old now. And she remembered that one time when I was just planted. That was important because I'm always running around hither and thither.
Sure.
But I was planted and I listened. That's one of the things that we urge people to bring back into their families, this whole notion of just really focus and listen and try to understand and hold back on the advice.
In your experience, in your travels, and the work that you've done, what are the hallmarks of a great leader?
I will start that answer by focusing on our own research in the area. So Peter and I guess you could label our body of work Mastering Leadership Communication. That's what we've been looking at. And over our decades of research and teaching, we have divided it into 3 segments. So we believe that there are 3 bodies of work that leaders need in order to master leadership communication. One is the ability to master conflict, to not run for it, to not flee, to not go to silence, to not talk to someone else just as a sounding board or to get it off my chest, but to be able to go right into the center of the issue and communicate in a way that the problem is solved, the relationship is strengthened, and trust is deepened. So the ability to master group facilitation, to me, is another leadership must. And the third would be what I would call persuasion and influence. A leader needs to be able to speak to a group, whether that be a board or an audience of 500 people, in a way that the issues I care about, the programs I support, the direction I want to foster, the vision I have, become important to the people that I'm speaking with. So
it's not a matter of holding back. I mean, some of the most successful entrepreneurs that we see here are very motivated, creative, dynamic people. And yet the really good ones can take things home from a conference, for example, and take that excitement and take those new ideas and put them out in such a way that the people they're speaking to are invited and compelled to really adhere to what she or he is saying, and not to say, oh, here we go again. He went to a conference, we've got a new idea, we've got to readjust. But they can put out those, because we haven't spoken to this third component much, but they can marshal all the available means of persuasion and put it out in such a way that people are compelled to want to join along. So from our vantage point in the work that we do, that's what makes a really compelling leader, an effective leader, a leader that can really build a business and keep it going.
I think that's a great spot to finish. Thank you so much for your time.
You're
we
welcome.
could spend another 60 minutes just on the persuasion point, I think.
I
But
know.
I really appreciate you digging deep.